Up from the bottomless pit, chapter 16. Cable was angry at the old man. This was an irrational reaction. He was angry at himself, which was rational. He'd wasted time and energy, neither of which he could afford, because of a temporary softness. None of that, no more of that. He heard noises at the back door and walked down the short hall to the kitchen. Several of the old people who had been sitting in the front yard were at the sink filling glasses with water. They looked at him but said nothing. He said, "There's a dead man in the front room, but there's also some potato salad." He turned and went through the house to the front door. A fly was on the lower lip of the old man's open mouth. Malone, Williamson, Jenkins, and Adkins were standing by the gate. They didn't seem surprised to see him, so they must have observed him going into the house. Evidently, they did not want to proceed without him. For some reason that was beyond him, they had decided to rely on him. Even Malone was watching him with expectancy. Somewhere during the brief passage from the Cowpax building to this house, he had lost his drive to be the leader. But if he should survive, he would never be able to forgive Cable for having become the dominant member of the group. He looked at their sweating, drawn faces and cracked lips. Heat and fear were pumps driving the water from them. Of the two, fear was the strongest. Malone took a bottle from his pocket, started to uncap it. Cable said, "You'd better save all that you can. There's water inside the house. Go in there. Fill up your bellies." Malone put the bottle back. Adkins said, "You won't leave us while we're in there?" "Don't dawdle," Cable said, though he knew the advice was superfluous. It was better to say something, though, and he had no intention of making any promises. Malone, Jenkins, and Adkins hastened up the walk. Williamson said, "I'll stay. I drank enough at the office for 2 camels. In fact, I got a bellyache from it. You'd think a doctor would know better, wouldn't you?" Cable, watching Adkins, said, "She's limping already. She'll never make it with bare feet, especially on hot pavement." "Yeah, I know," Williamson said. "Maybe she should have left her high heels on." "Either way, she's screwed." "That's a hard-hearted way to look at it," the doctor said, but he didn't seem shocked. "I should have told her to look for shoes that might fit her in the house," Cable said. He hesitated a moment, and then went after her. Just as he got to the front door, he saw her through the screen. She was sitting in a chair, across from the sofa with the dead man. She had one of the old man's flat-heeled shoes on, and was putting on another. She tied them while he waited. "They fit," she called. "Maybe you'll make it after all," Cable murmured. A moment later, Malone came out of the kitchen, followed by 3 white-haired and wrinkled women. Adkins did not wait for him, but went through the door ahead of him. Malone turned to the door and shouted something at one of the old women. He slammed the door in her face and ran after Adkins and Cable, who had not stopped walking but had been watching over their shoulders. "Jesus Christ," he said. "You won't believe it, but that old woman offered me $1,000 cash and all her jewelry if I'd help her. I told her I'd drop more than that in 10 minutes at Las Vegas. She began cursing me. You never heard such language from an old lady." "You'd have done the same thing if it had been your grandmother," Adkins said. Malone looked startled. "What? The hell's the matter with you, Myrna?" "What did you expect from her?" Williamson said. "She's letting loose 20 years of frustration and resentment." Cable said, "Save your breath. Where's Jenkins?" Malone looked around and said, "I don't know. He went into the crapper. That's the last I saw of him." "He looked awful, pale, gray. In fact," Adkins said, "do you suppose he's sick?" "Let's go," Cable said. He turned away and began walking. Adkins ran after him and took hold of his arm. "Are you going to leave Jenkins there?" Cable shook her hand off and said, "Look, I tried to get it into your head that we can't be burdened. If you try to help somebody else, you're going to get caught along with them. It may seem heartless, but it's stupid to throw away your life trying to help somebody that can't be helped. Get that now, because I'm not going to say another word about it. And what if you get sick or hurt? Then you go on without me if you have any sense. Nevertheless, he could not help wondering if he might cut back north to Wiltshire to get to Westwood. He had already rejected the idea that he could find Lee and his daughter there, and going north would bring him that much closer to the fires sweeping down the hills. Yet, what if they could not for some reason walk? What if Lee or Katie were sick? What if? There were 1,000 what ifs, and to think about them would drain him of strength and resolution. And there was Dorothy. Where was she? If she'd come ashore, she doubtless was with her crew, filming the exodus, recording the fire and the people fleeing from it when she and the crew should be running with the rest. But she was tough. She could take care of herself. Nevertheless, the crowd ahead, relatively a loose assemblage, suddenly became packed. He stopped and Adkins bumped into him. "What is it?" she said breathlessly. "Just another barricade of cars," he said. People climbing over the cars where Sloat meets Olympic are holding up those behind. It's going to be this way at every corner. Williamson joined them. A few seconds later, Malone had caught up with them. "Jesus," Malone said. "It'll take us 3 times as long. Isn't there any other way? What about the smaller streets, the side streets?" "They'll be just as jammed with cars and people," Cable said. Cable stepped forward as those ahead moved about a foot. The sky everywhere was black, and the air had become a little darker during the half-a-block passage. He sniffed, thought he could smell a trace of smoke, though that could be his imagination. It would, however, only be a matter of time, and then the smoke would be on them. As the fires got closer, the smoke would get thicker. How many hundreds of thousands of bushes and trees, how many thousands of houses were burning up there? And how long before this parade became a stampede? He moved another step forward. Adkins plucked the sleeve of his shirt. He looked back, and she said, "That child?" He'd been aware of an infant's crying nearby, but had made no attempt to locate its source, nor did he want to do so. Now, at Adkins' insistence, he looked to his right. The bodies of those between him and the building blocked his view for a moment. Then he glimpsed a huge black woman sitting on the sidewalk with her back against the building. By her side stood a black girl of about 3 years of age. She was crying loudly and at the same time tugging on the woman's shoulder. The crowd closed up again, and he could no longer see the two. "What about it?" he said. "The woman looks like she's passed out. Maybe she's dead." Cable said nothing. Adkins left him, pushing through the people who gave way reluctantly before her determination. Cable caught sight briefly of Williamson kneeling down by the woman. He was looking into her eyes and feeling her pulse. Cable gained another foot toward the intersection. He looked to his left and saw several young men and women on top of the cars on Olympic. They were going westward, walking on the roofs, stepping down to the hoods, leaping up onto the roof of the next. There were not enough of them to slow down their passage. The only thing limiting their speed was their degree of agility and endurance. Cable had thought of that roof, but he had decided it was far too exhausting. It would take a mountain goat to travel on that up and down hazardous route. Maybe a fresh youth in good shape could make it to the coast, but he was 34 and had been wrung out emotionally and physically this morning. Yet it would take him all day, and maybe part of the night, to get to the other end of Olympic at this rate. This was a race, and yet he was forced to travel not much faster than a tortoise. And to survive, he had to be a hare. He pushed through the crowd in a zigzag, caused by the hard resistance of some and the non-aggressiveness of others. A man snarled at him, "Watch it, you son of a bitch." but most of the stand-fasts just glared at him or leaned their bodies against him. Reaching the edge of the sidewalk, he climbed on his hands and knees onto the hood of the nearest car. It was a light green Impala Chevrolet. The car just ahead was a tiny convertible 1958 Volkswagen, its top down. He stepped down onto the sloping rear and from it into the back seat. It was another step over the back of the right front seat and over the windshield and onto its hood. In front of it was a car seen only in some numbers in Beverly Hills and Bel Air. It was a silver cloud Rolls Royce, which had a rear that did not slope gently. Instead of trying its steep back, he jumped onto the hood of the Dodge Demon beside the Volkswagen. And he told himself that his wits must be getting dull. He should have avoided the convertible because it took too much energy to get across a low open vehicle. He should have stepped across the Buick from the Impala. He paused for a moment, looking ahead and then behind. 6 cars directly ahead loomed the rear of an Onondaga motorhome. He'd have to go around that. Also ahead were a number of people climbing up from the sidewalk. Like him, they had finally understood that there was only one fast escape route. And like him, they must have been dulled by the mass mentality, the sluggish overbrain of the crowd. Behind him came some young people who had taken this rough highway some time before. And along the edges of the jam on both sides of the street, others were leaving the sidewalk and its jam. If this continued, the tops of the cars would also be soon crowded, but not, however, as thickly as the sidewalks. There were too many, the old, the sick, those hampered with small children, who could not or would not get up on the vehicles. Malone's and Adkins's faces appeared over the top of a Mercury MX station wagon. Williamson joined them several seconds later. Adkins disappeared, reappeared with the small black face of the little girl he'd seen crying by her collapsed mother. She was boosted, still weeping and bawling, onto the roof of the wagon. A moment later, the 2 men and the women were on the hood. Adkins took the child's hand and helped her onto the next vehicle, an Oldsmobile Toronado. Cable did not intend to wait for them. He knew without asking what had happened. The black woman was either dead or too sick to go on, and Adkins had been unable to abandon the child. He hoped that she would have no cause to regret her decision, but he doubted it. He turned away, stepped down from the roof onto the hood, and sprang across to the trunk cover of a Plymouth Duster Custom. He went over its roof and onto its hood and sprang again. After passing over about 12 cars, he was forced to step across to the Ford Gran Torino behind him. 6 youths sat jammed on the roof of the car ahead, a Lincoln Continental. From their loud gaspings, they had evidently been going too swiftly. This was a mistake. The time they'd made in racing was being lost in resting. Moreover, running up would eat up energy out of all proportion to the distance gained. This wasn't going to be a dash. As Cable passed the group, one of them, a plump, huge-breasted blonde in scarlet halter and blue shorts, said, "Hey, he's got a bottle. How about a drink, mister?" Cable did not reply. He jumped to the next car, but when he was 7 cars away from the youth, stopped to look back. The 3 males had stepped out onto the roof of the Oldsmobile Delta 88 Royal next to them, and were waiting for Malone. They had spotted the bottle sticking out of his coat pocket. Malone crossed to the roof of a Mercury Montego to avoid them, but they leaped across to face him. They pulled long switchblade knives out of the back pockets of their Levi's. Malone, his face red, shouted something at them. They started toward him, but he pulled the .45 automatic out of his belt and pointed it at them. He yelled again and waved the gun, and they jumped back to the roof with the girls. Malone waited until the doctor and Adkins and the child had passed him. He jumped to the Mercury Cougar ahead, whirled to make sure the youths weren't about to jump him from behind, saw they weren't, and proceeded. The youths were shouting obscenities at him and gesturing with their extended middle fingers, but it was obvious they were afraid to tackle him. At least, they were not going to do it at once. When Malone had crossed 4 cars, they stepped onto the next one and started after him at a walk. Maybe they were just going on after resting, or maybe they intended to wait until they could catch Malone off guard. Whichever the case, It was no business of his, Cable told himself. He stepped onto the trunk lid of a Dodge Monaco. 10 cars ahead, the towering rear of another trailer blocked his path. Between Fairfax and La Cienega was a stretch of 10 blocks, approximately 3/4 of a mile. He looked at his wristwatch. It had taken him 20 minutes since he had climbed onto the first car. A man carrying a knapsack on his back, a canteen on his belt, and holding a transistor radio went by in the next lane. Cable called to him. "Say anything about the fires in the north?" The man, without slowing, shouted, "It's about 2 miles south from Mulholland Drive, all along the Santa Monica Range." "How far has it gotten into Santa Monica City from Venice?" Cable had shouted, but the man increased his pace without replying. Cable caught up to him and said, "Do you know how much of the Santa Monica is on fire?" The man looked annoyed, but he said, "It's almost to Ocean Park Boulevard." That would mean that the flames were very close to Olympic, Cable thought. He felt a shock, almost a blow, pass through him. At the rate he was traveling, all of Santa Monica would be burning before he even got close to it. The flames were sweeping along far more swiftly than he had expected, both from the north and the south. He wasn't quite sure how far the city of Beverly Hills extended to the north. He did know that it flung out a pseudopod from its northwest side, one that covered many houses in the canyons. If the fire hadn't reached that area, it soon would. As the flames raced down the canyons and jumped the ridges, it would spill into the heavily populated northern part. And the same thing would happen to Bel Air, everywhere south of the hills. From his slight elevation, he could see a bright flicker among the hills. The smoke was heavier, oily looking now. He turned to look southwestward. The smoke from the Venice area was just as visible. The winds were, however, rushing it off to the ocean. Eventually, and not soon, he prayed, the recirculation of heated air would start a firestorm. Then the winds would become strong, would hit the people with ever hotter air, would make houses untouched by the fire begin to send up curls of smoke, He couldn't bear to think about any more of that. He had to go on, keeping the panic down so he wouldn't start running, think of nothing but the end of his road. The end of the road. It could no longer be on Olympic, but he'd have to cut north. Not yet. He'd wait until he got to Spalding, which cut across Olympic to go north. Until then, Olympic went straight west. He should have stayed on Wilshire.